I kind of want to talk a little bit about how I think about UI stuff, because everybody has their own approach to this, I think. It seems like there are as many different approaches to design and UI as there are people out there. When I'm at work, usually there's kind of a pattern where UIs are designed by, a dedicated designer. And there's something where we have, either product or engineering coming up with a list of requirements or goals, and then collaborating with the UI designer to construct a UI that meets those requirements. And, maybe a low fidelity or a high fidelity mock-up. And then that mock-up is sent to engineering to implement. And depending on where you are, some companies expect maybe a pixel perfect implementation of that mock-up, especially if it's a high fidelity one. Or it might be more of a recommendation or an example for engineering to follow, but there's not an expectation of that pixel perfect duplication. A lot of that goes into how much effort was actually put into that mock-up in the first place as well. But when I'm working on apps by myself, I don't consider myself to be an amazing UI designer. Not because I'm an engineer, because there are some engineers that are amazing UI designers. It's not like they're incompatible. But just for me personally, I don't get very excited about the idea of building a pixel perfect or idealized UI. But what I do like is a UI where it's highly usable. And that's kind of my goal when I'm building a UI, is to focus on the user experience of the application as opposed to thinking too much about how it looks. A lot of my apps have, a pretty black and white theme, for example, because that's easier to implement. But I try and streamline the interface as much as possible to allow common actions to be easy, while also making uncommon actions possible and intuitive to find. And that's kind of the approach I'll be taking with this app as well. Part of that is understanding the proper UI primitives to represent the data that you're actually trying to build a UI for, right? When you're building a web app, the UI is fundamentally the way that the users are interacting with your application. But the data in the database and the structure of that data fundamentally represents the goals and the needs of what the application is trying to support. Like in this case, we have this ability to log sets for a given day, sets of an exercise. And that is something where that's a core functionality or goal of the application. And the UI should be built around making that as easy as possible. And also, when a user is interacting with the app, it's not uncommon for them to mostly interact with just a couple pages. Like in this particular case, we have this today page, which, you can go to the past, so it's not always just today, but the principle of the page is the same. And this is where users are going to be logging their exercise. They'll be interacting with this page maybe 3 to 5 days a week, multiple times per day. Probably an environment where they're going to want it to be rapidly functional. Like they just did some exercises, they want to log that. They don't really want to have to think about that too hard or to use a bunch of clicks. It should be fast and easy. In contrast, something like the Manage Exercises page is something that users might not really need to go to very often at all. Maybe just once or twice a month. And even that is probably mostly just in order to see these graphs. They're not really going to be changing the settings on these exercises all that much or creating new exercises all that frequently. And so this page, it's more important for it to be usable, but not necessarily in a minimal number of clicks. At least that's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now. We'll see as we go. The settings page is similar where, the user might only go in here once to set their settings and then never come back. And so we want to make it clear how the settings are set. One of the problems with this page right now is it doesn't have help text. And there's other problems as well. But ultimately, the settings page doesn't need to be very fancy. And kind of for that reason, I'm going to focus my exercises on doing the today page first. So for the today page, what is the data model that we're talking about here? We have a list of sets, right? Multiple sets per day. Those sets have an order associated with them. That order is actually a property of the schema. If we look at the sets table here, there's an order property that describes what order they should be in. So our page is going to need to respect that. And it has, this set of parameters, some number of parameters. As we can see here, there's like weight, assisted weight, distance, duration, intensity. And some of those might be used for a given exercise and some of them might not be. So what we have here, in my mind, what that is sounding like, we have a list of entities. And for each of those entities, there's potentially multiple parameters that need to be set for those entities. So we have like a two-dimensional layout. And this feels like a table. Now, I don't necessarily think we want to use an actual HTML table here. In fact, I wouldn't even use like a CSS grid table necessarily, but something where it has that structure of one row per set. And within that row, there's multiple columns, quote unquote, for each parameter for that set. And in the mobile view, those columns can collapse. This is kind of how I'm thinking about it. And then logging an exercise is an interesting case as well, because we're going to be trying to basically add a row to that table. A lot of times when you do that, kind of the way that I like to think about it is, yes, you could have a separate UI for that. Maybe you have an add button that you click and it pops up a modal dialog. Maybe there's a separate section on the bottom of the page, just like this. But kind of a nice way to do it is to actually create a row in the table that's like the yet to be created set. And the user can just fill out that row as though the set already exists, and it will, be created for them. And then another row will automatically appear underneath for them to create their next set.